Data retention refers to how long we should have our data. How long should we keep our data? And one of the tendencies with the cloud, so this is one of the problems with the cloud, is that the cloud providers want us to store the data and never delete it. They just want to keep it forever. That's not necessarily because they want us to pay for it forever. In fact, some of them don't even charge you for that storage, right? So they don't charge you to store the data. I talked about this before. Some of them only charge you to read the data back because they just want to store that data. Google's a great example of that. They just want the entire world's data in their infrastructure so they can do things with it, presumably, or whatever it is that they do. Nobody really knows. But um, that's kind of at odds with what we want to do. Now, intuitively, some people think, well, gosh, what's the harm in keeping the data forever? Well, most organizations don't want to keep the data any longer than they have to. If we were in a classroom right now, I would ask you to try to brainstorm that. Why is it that you think that organizations want to make sure that they're deleting their data when it's no longer needed? And the answer to that is their security posture. If the data isn't there to get stolen, it can't get stolen, right? So, we want to make sure. So, if we store credit card numbers, for example, if there's no reason for me to store somebody's credit card number any longer because they're not a customer, because they're past the date that I would ever need to do anything with that customer for that particular transaction, then why keep it? I should delete it just to make absolutely sure it's not going to get stolen or get compromised. All of that private data I store about people. I work in healthcare, and in healthcare, I mean, yeah, we'd like to keep medical records as long as we can, but most of us only store them as long as required by the law. Once the law tells us that it's okay for us to delete it, 99% of the time we're scrambling to make sure we have a policy and a control and some technology in place to make sure that happens. Sometimes the reasons for that are a bit morbid. It can open up lawsuits, right? So if you get sued, in normal business, you get sued, there's discovery where you have to turn over all of the documents that might be relevant to the case. Well, if you have removed that data through your own policy because it's no longer relevant, then it's not susceptible to that discovery. So it could help you in that case. You're not revealing information that isn't necessarily that's not going to damage you. In healthcare, sometimes we like to delete that data because if a patient's going to sue for malpractice, let's say, for example, a patient goes in and gets a chest X-ray, and the radiologist says the patient's perfectly healthy, and they send them home. 6 years later, they go to their doctor because they have a bad cough, and the doctor says, goes and they get a chest X-ray, and come to find out they've got lung cancer and they've got 6 months to live. And the patient says, well, gee, I had a chest X-ray 6 years ago. That doctor really should have seen this lung cancer. It was probably started, a decade ago, according to the specialist. So they're going to sue for that. Well, if my data retention policy is 5 years, the patient shows up, I'm like, well, I don't have those records anymore. Well, now there's really nothing they can do, right? From a patient's perspective, that stinks. But from the physician and from the malpractice insurance perspective, that's a good thing. Where the truth lies is probably somewhere in the middle. But I guess the takeaway here is save all your medical records in case you ever need them, because you can't always count on them being available. So we want to make sure that we're able to delete files. Now, here's the problem with the cloud. The cloud does not give us clear tools to delete our data. They don't want us to delete our data in many cases. So one of the ways that we can, now let me just tell you this as well. Let's say you stored an object into the cloud, or you have a hard drive that you're using in a VM, and you decide you're going to remove it and you delete it. What assurance do you have that that's actually been deleted? What's probably really happened in many cases is it's simply been unlinked. It's been it's no longer accessible to you or to anyone else outside the cloud, but that data is still there, right? There's no requirement that they have to delete it unless that's codified into your service level agreement. So if we don't have that control, how do I make sure that something is deleted? Well, one of the other techniques you have is cryptographic erasure. Basically, what you're doing is you're overwriting that data. You're using a hash, for example, to overwrite the data so that basically it's junk, and then it can't be used, right? So that's cryptographic shredding, basically, is one of the techniques. I don't know how effective that technique is. One of the problems with that technique is the cloud provider sometimes has many replicants of your data, and they may store previous versions. So what a lot of cloud providers do is if I store a file or an object, and then I store a new version of that object, the old version is essentially deleted and replaced with the new version. But what they really do, from my perspective as a user, that's what happens. But really what happens is they're simply adding a new object and disassociating the old object. But they still have it, right? So if I use cryptographic shredding, I know that might work in my own environment, but that may not actually work in a in the cloud environment, because they may still have that copy from before I use cryptography. So, gosh, I feel like I'm going to convince everyone to put a foil hat on as far as this data retention goes. But it is very difficult to guarantee deletion of that data. So that is certainly a major concern. And then we have data archiving. So in archiving, all security controls must continue to apply once you archive it. And a lot of people forget about this. So it is important that once you've archived your data, to make sure that all of those controls that we put in place continue to apply to that archived data. Especially in the cloud, it's easy to forget about the data once it's been archived. It's easy for us to forget that data has been archived to a place where maybe we can go get it later. Well, we definitely could. But we forget about it because we're not paying for it. It's just kind of sitting out there. But all of this stuff still has to continue to apply. And finally, we want to make sure we have some way to audit all of this stuff. We've talked about a little bit about auditing before. Auditing is basically knowing who, what, when, and where something happened, being able to go back in time to see what happened. With infrastructure as a service, we should have access to do full auditing with infrastructure as a service. We have access to everything, hopefully, with infrastructure as a service. All those log files, we should have full unfettered access to those things. With platform as a service, not so much. Applications have to do the logging, but our access to those physical systems to do a full audit is questionable. And then for software as a service, almost all of it is controlled by the provider. They control what's being logged. They control what type of auditing we can do, and usually have to make sure that that's codified in some kind of an SLA to know what we're able to do with auditing down the road. For example, if you're using something like Salesforce in the cloud, which is probably one of the big cloud applications that businesses use, as far as how do I audit who did what, when, and where, I have to rely on their software to give me that information and to log enough for me to be able to piece that together. And maybe they do, maybe they don't, but that's something that you should be aware of. And that concludes our discussion on data security concepts in the cloud.